Welcome back to Second Breakfast. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking the whole time. Cam's not going to say a word. No, that's not true. That's not true. But Cam is going to say few words because Cam has a small mouth injury that's making speech a little bit difficult. But he loves you all so much that he's going to push through and do this episode regardless.
Yeah, so if I sound a little stupid, that's why.
He can't say certain letters. It's actually very funny for me.
A, B, C, D, E, F.
F.
We can't really do F today.
It'll be fine. It'll be great.
That said, this was a fantastic chapter.
It was really fun. I really enjoyed it. So we got to meet Daenerys in this chapter. It was a great time. I'm going to do a quick little recap and then we'll dive right into our discussion. Why are you laughing?
Daenerys and Viserys.
Oh, you can't say Viserys, can you?
No, I can say it carefully.
Why don't you just call him the dragon or something?
Yeah.
The boy king, I don't know. Or the beggar king, as others like to call him.
It's a great name.
It is. All right, let's get into it. So this is Game of Thrones Daenerys #1. So if you recall, we've been up in the north. We've been with like Catelyn and Bran and like all that stuff over there and the Starks. We're in a totally different location here. So we meet Daenerys Targaryen, also known as Dany. Sure, her chapter title says Daenerys, but throughout the narration, she's called Dany. I kind of don't think anybody like in the story actually calls her Dany though, which is really interesting. Like, I don't think we ever see that in like dialogue, which is funny. But anyway, she's Dany to us. Okay. And she is age 13. She currently lives in the free city of Pentos, which is across the narrow sea east of Westeros, not even on the map. There's a map in this copy of the book I have, there's a map at the beginning of the north and a map at the end of the south. Only Westeros. This shit isn't even on the map, okay? So we also meet her brother Viserys, who's about 21, 22. And he is prepping Dany for marriage to Khal Drogo, the leader of the Dothraki. He's hoping to recruit their soldiers so that Viserys can claim the Iron Throne of Westeros. So backstory. We get a lot of backstory in this chapter, as we have been in these early chapters. Dany and Viserys are the children of Mad King Aerys II, the one who was overthrown by King Robert Baratheon. And Ned, he helped. Okay. And they fled from Westeros when Dany was a baby. They were sort of shepherded off by a loyal soldier, basically, from King Aerys' court. That soldier is now dead, but Viserys, who was like 8 or 9, and Dany, who was a baby, were taken from Westeros and like they fled to the east. Basically, they've been living sort of like bouncing around from city to city or from town to town, place to place throughout their whole lives because they are on the run. Viserys is very concerned that Robert has hired people to come kill them, so they're sort of on the run trying to, not die. They've slowly been like depleting their resources. They've been like selling all their stuff and like now they're pretty poor and they live kind of a pretty sad existence. They're currently like living with / are being helped and shepherded by a guy named Illyrio who lives in Pentos and is basically a merchant dealer, and he's kind of a skeevy criminal kind of guy, but he has a lot of money and is willing to help them, with the presumption that he will be like in their favor when Viserys takes the throne.
He's a Thénardier.
Yes, that's a really good way to describe him. And so we also learned that Viserys has an anger problem. He is constantly warning Dany not to, quote, wake the dragon, which is like the cringiest thing. I'm going to get into how cringe Viserys is later, I think. He's striking me in a really different light than when I first read and saw this story. And so he's sort of like, she's getting dressed, ready to go to like present herself to Khal Drogo so that they can form an alliance and Viserys can use the Dothraki soldiers. So they arrive at Khal Drogo's palace. There's like a huge party going on. There's lots of Dothraki there. The Dothraki are like, the people in this part of the universe are very coded as being like Eastern, quote unquote, like basically not European, not white is sort of the situation there. And Viserys refers to the Dothraki as savages, and Dany thinks of them as barbarians. So they've got like a really, even though they've been living in this part of the world their whole lives, they still feel very much like outsiders compared to the people here.
Well, their whole thing is sort of an entitlement.
Right.
To sort of a European coded crown.
Well, and there's
so
like,
they think they're above this exile.
Exactly. We also learn that like in the Targaryen line, that often, in an effort to keep the blood pure, siblings would marry each other.
In an effort to keep the eyes crossed.
Yeah, right. So that's sort of the mentality we're working with here. Also at the palace, there are lots of other people there besides the Dothraki. There are lots of people from different places. Also there is Ser Jorah Mormont, who is a knight from Westeros. He fled from Westeros based on like a weird criminal charge where he like sold something illegally. It was kind of stupid.
A person.
Okay, well, was that what it was?
Yes.
Oh, I fully missed that.
Because Illyrio goes on a whole tear about how a man should be able to do what he wants with his own,
Yeah, I just missed that it was a person.
Yeah.
Oh, yikes. Way to go.
It was like a slaver dispute thing.
Oh, I fully missed that. Okay, well, way to go, Jorah. Anyway, so he's from Westeros, and he is like apparently loyal to the Targaryen cause. So there's that.
But he's also in exile.
Yes.
And it would benefit him to have... Oh, do you see that? Do you see me trip over the F?
It
would benefit him to have a friend like them.
Yeah.
Because if they go back into power, he could then ride back into Westeros as well.
And then he can go back to where he's from. Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, we meet Khal Drogo, who is very tall, very big.
Tall Drogo?
It's because the next word is he is tall. So tall Drogo. And Dany finds him very, very frightening and intimidating. He's like this big guy. He's like, remember, Dany's 13. This guy is like almost 30, which is ancient when you're 13 years old. And he just looks big and scary and foreign. And Dany sort of starts to panic, and she's like, I don't want to marry this guy. I don't want to do any of this. I just want to go home. And Viserys sort of loses it. He's like, what do you mean go home? Our home is Westeros. We have to do this. And he says some pretty awful things to Dany about how he'd like sell her to all the Dothraki if it meant that he could have their army. So it's pretty shitty. And he basically just says that she has to do this or he's going to force her because they need this alliance. And so he tells her to like pull it together and smile. And she does. And then the chapter ends. So really what this chapter served, a lot like Catelyn's chapter, the last one we read, was to give us a lot of backstory on just the state of the geopolitical landscape that we're working in, while also doing great character introduction and just expanding the world and the universe that we're working in. I thought it was pretty great. It's so hard to do exposition, especially when it's like a whole new, high fantasy world where you have to give a lot of backstory and context and explain like not only the political situation, but like magic systems and religion and races and cultures and all these things. And I just think he's doing this really, really well in like these bite-sized chunks where there's still a lot, like if you're a first-time reader, like I have to remember that because I know what all this stuff is because I've seen the show, I've read the books, but if you are brand new to this, I think it's still introduced in bite-sized chunks that feel really digestible, even though not every question is answered off the bat. And I found myself being really impressed by that here.
Yeah, because it doesn't feel like exposition. Even though he's kind of drawing a map of the world outside Westeros, it still is a scene. It still is action. So much happens here, even though there's also a lot of world building under the surface.
And I think the reason it works so well is because all the backstory he gives, it's backstory on the world, but at its core, it's backstory on the characters. And it's like, it's serving, like it's telling us about this world and helping us understand it and contextualize it. But more importantly, it's really helping us understand the characters and what motivates them and what they care about and where they've come from. Like that's like all the stuff we learned about with the old gods and the new gods and the North versus the South and all that last chapter. That was telling us about who Catelyn is and also who Ned is. Like it was telling us about the universe, but it was really telling us about them as people. And that's what's happening here with Dany.
I remember so much of the contents of this chapter from the show.
Yeah.
Because when the show was an adaptation, which is what they signed up to do, I think it was an unbelievably good adaptation.
Me too.
And I remember almost everything. I was picturing this along through the first episode or so.
Oh, yeah, me too.
And it's so beautifully captured. The one big difference that I got reading this versus watching it is Dany's age.
Oh, God. Yeah, they aged her up in the show. Like, they age all the kids up in the show.
Right.
But especially
but particularly Dany.
Yeah.
And I think that was maybe where my notes began, is trying to understand these scenes that I'm so familiar with from the view of a 13-year-old.
I know.
Because I used to think of her as sort of the, young adult that they present like her with Emilia Clarke as.
Yeah, between like 16 and 18, like still very young and innocent, but also like old enough to start having adult thoughts,
But after the previous chapters with Bran and Catelyn, I'm so in that Stark mindset.
Yeah.
That the way I thought of Dany here, being a 13-year-old, I thought of her in the context of the Stark children.
Right, of Bran being 7 and watching a beheading.
Yeah, like I thought of her as, I mean, in the same way Jon Snow is like an outsider to this group of children, Dany feels like that.
Yeah.
And I never thought of her in relation to the Stark children before, but she would be on that upper end. She'd be like, what, a little younger than Robb and Jon?
Yeah, she's a year younger than Robb and Jon. They're 14.
I never thought about them like that.
Yeah.
I think that's quite poignant and makes her situation even more tragic and miserable.
Yeah.
But I think another difference is that we've spent so much time kind of tinkering through the history of the Starks in Winterfell and the Godswood. And here, Dany doesn't have any of her own history. She just has dead family up the line. And all of her memories and history and destiny is all tied up in dead family. But for her, herself, she just has, breakfast at the Thénardiers. She doesn't have anything.
Yeah, she doesn't remember anything about Westeros. She barely remembers, like even like the first place she lived in after they left, like because she was a baby. And so she doesn't remember any of this.
It reminded me of how haunted and uncomfortable Catelyn felt walking into the Godswood in the last chapter.
Yeah.
I think there's that same sense of someone walking over your grave in this chapter, but I wanted to broaden that out a little bit and consider Dany's introduction relative to our two big grindstones that have emerged in our coverage of Game of Thrones, and those are death and prophecy. Sorry about the voice this time.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
I'm doing my best. So Dany, I think, more than any character we've met so far, is leading a life that is marked by death. All these family members that have been assassinated, all of these assassins that they've sensed, on their heels during this life on the run, she's followed by death. She's marked by death. She's almost defined by death. Similarly, more than anyone we've met, Dany is a victim of prophecy.
Okay.
And they're prophecies that are ancillary to her, but very much ruining her life.
Okay.
She's the collateral damage. She's almost a prop or a tool. You see the way Viserys kind of positions her like a pawn on a chessboard.
Yeah.
The prophecy's not about her, but she's very much essential to it.
So when you say prophecy, what are you referring to? Just like this imagined prophecy in Viserys' head? Like what they're meant to do to reclaim the throne?
I found myself thinking a lot again about Macbeth, which was the big thing I was playing with last week.
Yeah.
And I think that's because Macbeth is a story about how prophecy affects people.
Yeah.
It's not really about whether or not it's true. Yes, there are witches. Yes, there are supernatural elements. But I think it's much more, if you look at any of the scenes between Macbeth and Banquo, when the witches give them a prophecy saying, you will be king, and your kids will be kings. The way that prophecy affects them, the way it drives them to murder and insanity, I think that's what the play is about.
Totally.
And similarly, I think this story, if it's also about death and prophecy, I think there's a lot of Macbeth here, especially because George is pulling from European history and mythology in the same way Shakespeare was playing with those ideas and legacies. I think Viserys is a much harsher complication of the way we were talking about Macbeth and prophecy last week, because he has that level of cruelty and entitlement that Macbeth does at the end of the play.
Yes.
When he thinks he is so impervious, so fated, so protected and destined that he doesn't even have to raise a sword and people will just die around him because he is untouchable, because he's protected. No woman born can attack and kill him. Viserys has that same total pig-headed arrogance. But the way George is kind of turning that on its ear is by making Viserys such a meaningless prick.
Yeah.
All he does is undercut Viserys.
Yes.
And this quest. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But to tie that back to how it's affecting Dany, I think positioning this chapter through Daenerys' eyes and making her the POV character, Viserys will never get that honor.
Right.
it reframes the whole conversation, not just around prophecy, but about consequence. How the prophecy is affecting Dany's life, the knock-on effects of this thing that goes so far beyond just Viserys.
I see, yeah.
And we're also seeing how wrong things can go. Because we've got a 13-year-old. We spent the previous 2 chapters following on consequences and looking at this group of kids with the Starks and how their parents are talking about them and what their fate is. And, they've got these new dogs. But I think here we're seeing how wrong things can go for a child.
Yes.
Where they're pretty safe. Yes, we know there are like White Walkers from the prologue, but the Stark kids seem okay right now.
Yeah, for now. It really only becomes bad when they leave.
And here we see a kid around the same age.
Yeah.
And we get this massive jump in scale to show you exactly how horrible life can be.
Yeah.
We get this introduction of a much bigger world. This is the first time we've really left Winterfell. We get Pentos. We're even outside of Westeros. We get multiple royal histories. We get this huge, sprawling, wide-angle lens in this story. And it reminded me of the way The Witcher, the way Sapkowski would track consequence.
Okay,
where you would have some example of evil, usually, some problem of evil, and then he would butterfly effect all the way through the world and chase that down. I think George is doing something similar here. Because he's not just extending the conversation of death and prophecy and consequence into those collateral damage characters, but he's also, at the same time, massively expanding the world.
Yes.
Both geographically and temporally. There's so much history in this chapter, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I really like that. There's a lot I was thinking while reading this. One was like what struck me was, like you've been saying, how pathetic Viserys feels. He feels like such a loser. Like the first time I read this, and then even when I first saw the show, like again, like everybody's kind of aged up. So I really saw Viserys as this like real threat, like this like kind of crazy, but like power hungry, dangerous man who will do anything to get power, and that's terrifying, right? And of course, I mean, even in this chapter, we still see him as dangerous and scary to Dany. Dany talks about like in her head in the narration, she's like afraid to wake the dragon. She's afraid to upset him. But what really struck me was when she sees Khal Drogo. And the narration says something like, sometimes Viserys would hurt her and it was scary, but he was nowhere near as scary as this Khal Drogo guy. And like all throughout the chapter, there's like all this stuff about like Viserys has never actually wielded a sword. The sword he has right now is a borrowed sword that he doesn't know how to use. And there's a lot of like, Dany knew better. Viserys could never do this. Like we just get over and over this stuff about how much of a pathetic loser Viserys is and how much of a fraud he is. He wants so badly to be this destined king, this person who's destined for greatness and power, and like this person who is owed and like deserves and is entitled to this power, but he so has not earned it and will not earn it. And so when I'm reading this and trying to like think, okay, a first time reader, what are they thinking, right? Because so far we've met people who seem like major power players. We've met Ned Stark. We've met even Catelyn, right? And we've talked about Robert and the Lannisters. So we're like, okay, these are some of our big players. And then we go over here to these Targaryen heirs, these Targaryen children. And at first you think, oh yeah, that's a total threat. But then like as the chapter goes on, you're like, Viserys isn't a threat at all. He's sort of a loser. But what's interesting is that Dany's not really a threat either, because Dany, number one, is a 13-year-old child. Number two, she does not care about the throne right now. She does not give a shit about going back to Westeros and reclaiming the throne. Like, she just wants to, like, be okay. Like, we see her longing for this house that they lived in for a few years when she was really young in Bravos. She calls it the house with the red door. Like, that for her symbolizes, like stable, like being stable and just being
home,
at home,
like
and content, right? Like that's the thing she longs for. She doesn't care about the throne, at least not right now. We know she does later. But what I'm sitting here wondering is, like, who is the major player here? And right now it's kind of nobody. And that's what's really interesting, because like at one point, like Viserys says, when they write the history of my reign, they will say it began tonight. And I'm reading this knowing that, number one, he's not going to get much of a story at all. He's going to die soon. But I'm also reading this knowing, like, we're actually reading Dany's history right now. We're reading the story of her reign, or her attempted reign, from her perspective, from her point of view. And it's still not going to go the way that she thinks it's going to go.
So he's kind of auditioning to be the POV character and the one who matters. But I think Viserys is a vehicle for commentary.
Yes.
And I think Dany is potential.
Right. But what also struck me and like complicated that prophecy thing even more is in that same paragraph right after he says, like, when they write the history of my reign, in the narration it says about Dany, for a moment she wished she could be out there with them, barefoot and breathless and dressed in tatters, with no past and no future, and no feast to attend at Khal Drogo's manse. She doesn't want to be part of a prophecy. She doesn't want to be destined for anything. She just wants, like, peace and security. And so what I'm really wondering here is, what is going to be that change that makes her want the throne? Because truly, I don't remember.
Well, this is also the first chapter we've had so far that doesn't have a massive inciting incident.
Right.
It sets up the inciting incident with the Khal Drogo deal.
That's true,
but
yeah.
we don't really get there.
Yeah, we don't get a Jon Arryn died. Right.
I think what's happening here by not giving Dany that huge moment is that she seems more worthy. Because she doesn't have ambitions to the throne, in direct contrast to Viserys, who does and seems so unworthy.
Yes.
I think that makes her seem much more pure and
That's
level-headed.
True. We're really setting up these characters who don't want power. Dany, Jon, and Ned. Yes.
Right. That's always a good thing in this world.
Totally. But
what Dany reminded me of, and why I said she is a character of potential at this point, is because zooming out at who this woman is, or
child,
13-year-old. Yeah, I mean,
I know, poor girl. She has to grow up real fast, but yeah.
She's a young princess in exile, beset by abuse and exploitation. But by the nature of fantasy and narrativity, she feels already somehow faded.
Yes, of course she does. And that's the thing. She is outwardly rejecting that faded nature of that, but we still think that of her.
But who does that remind you of? A 13-year-old young princess in exile, beset by abuse and exploitation, who by the nature of fantasy feels faded.
You're talking about Ciri?
Yes.
From The Witcher?
And I've never thought about that before.
These young blonde princesses, yeah.
Which also makes Jorah her Geralt.
Oh, of course. Except, you know what? Geralt didn't try to fuck Ciri. But yeah. That's really interesting. I like that connection a lot.
I want to keep an eye on that going forward. I don't know if I have much to say about it now, but it's interesting to set the table that way.
Yeah,
because I think we learn things from every story we discuss here.
Also, both of those women have really unique special magic, Yes. So that's really interesting. I like that a lot.
And again, potential.
Yeah.
Because we don't know the full extent of Ciri's magic for 4 or 5... Jesus.
Yeah.
4 or 5 books after her introduction.
Yeah,
I have a little more about Viserys here.
Great.
The narrator...
You can call him the dragon if you can't say his name.
Thank God. The way the narrator undercuts Viserys, and I know it's a third-person limited sort of POV, so you could say it's just Dany sort of dumping on him in her head.
Yeah, I really see it as Dany, how Dany views him.
But it also feels like a hint that this guy's not going to be around forever, that we're never going to see him on the Iron Throne.
Yeah.
Which we don't even really know exists yet.
It's true. We don't even have the phrase the Iron Throne yet.
So maybe the question to you is, what is the effect of constantly undercutting and mocking Viserys?
I think what it mostly does is tell us about Dany, and that she's very smart and very aware and astute. There's over and over we see the words or something similar to Dany knew better. She's only 13, but she knows her brother really well. And even she's able to see through Illyrio. There's a lot about how she can tell Illyrio's lying. She doesn't believe him. She'll see something in his eyes that Viserys doesn't notice. It tells us about his character and how much of a loser he is, but really it tells us about Dany and how smart she is.
Do you think of Dany, looking back on your experience with the character across multiple mediums here, do you think of her as this sort of watchful, perceptive character?
No, in the early seasons, yes, but in the later seasons from the show, from what I remember, it's just her fumbling over and over, and her getting things wrong and misjudging situations and making the wrong choices. So that's really interesting. Like, I just, like, in my head, like, in the last, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 seasons, she just kind of, like, her head's too big and she is, like, overconfident and, like, keeps messing up. And then that feels almost like a reflection or an echo of Viserys. Right, and how he thinks he knows everything and is entitled to the throne. Like, there's actually a lot of mirroring going on there. I want to track that as we go.
Yeah.
Because I remember at the beginning thinking, she's so cool and powerful and smart and strong. But it's also hard because when I first met Dany, I was like 19 or 20. And like, that's when my, like, you know, my journey through like appreciating strong female characters and my like relationship with feminism has changed as I've gotten older. So it's also like hard for me to judge, but I don't remember her staying this smart. So that's interesting.
Yeah,
what about
something
you?
to keep an eye on. I don't know yet.
Okay.
I don't know yet because it has been so, I think my perception of the character has been so muddied by these different interpretations of her.
Yeah.
I have 2 more questions about Viserys and then I can stop talking. One is, I was really interested right at the end there where he's kind of hyping up Dany to go do this horrible thing. He compares Khal Drogo to a Targaryen when he's so precious about Targaryens being so much better and more special than anyone we've met in Pentos. And
pure, yeah.
He calls this guy who in other conversations he's referring to as a barbarian and a savage and all these other horrible, demeaning things. I mean, Khal Drogo's a piece of shit for other reasons.
Yeah.
But when he claims that Khal Drogo is Aegon the Dragon Lord come again.
Oh, that's right. He does say that. Yeah.
That really threw me.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't respect Khal Drogo at all. The only people he does respect are his incestuous relatives.
Do you think...
Well, that's the question. Is that an attempt to motivate Dany by like inspiring that comparison? Or on some level, because you were saying... you don't feel, and Dany doesn't feel, that Viserys would be a good king at all. Do you think when he sees Khal Drogo, he recognizes him as some sort of worthy royal rival? I think... is that comparison almost unconscious?
Yeah, I think it's in part to try to convince Dany and to like speak her language, even though it like doesn't work on her at all. Because again, she does not care about that kind of thing. But I think it's also maybe him trying to convince himself, like to justify this this tainted marriage, right? Because he is also like clearly of the mindset of keep the bloodline pure, the Targaryens are the best, blah blah blah, but he also knows he needs the Dothraki's help, and so he knows that this has to happen in order to make it work. Interesting that Viserys is not like marrying a Dothraki woman, right? Like he could have done that, I think, but I think maybe he thinks that this is, number one, maybe the wiser move. Number two means he doesn't have to taint any of his shit, right? So I think it's him kind of trying to convince both himself and Dany that this is worth it and that they can make this work.
It felt like a bit of a slip there.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think he would be shocked if he realized he made that comparison.
Yeah, I think you're right.
The last thing I want to talk about here is sort of zooming out, because we're getting variations on a theme here. We're talking about different themes, different histories, different historical events from different perspectives. And this is the most different perspective we've gotten so far. How does Viserys's farcical quest for the Iron Throne...
That was a lot of F sounds. I'm really proud of you.
I should have, when I wrote my notes, I should have just crossed out all the little Fs along the way. How does the ridiculous entitlement of this character, this would-be usurper, how does that change your opinion of the unknown King Robert and the current establishment royalty? Yeah,
right. Because so far we have not met Robert. We've only heard about him from Dany/Ned and Viserys, and so he's called either the usurper or like somebody's friend. So that's really interesting. I mean, I always find myself, even now, like having seen the whole show and read several of the books, like obviously King Aerys was bad. He went crazy. He like was like a total tyrant, like killed a lot of people. But also, I mean, well, the thing is, I'm just so anti-monarchy. And so I'm like, what right did Robert have? Do you know what I mean? Like he was
makes right.
He was a usurper, and Jaime killed the king, which you're not supposed to do. And like, but like when you break it down, it's because monarchy doesn't make sense, because it's all like follow the king no matter what, loyalty to the king no matter what. Ooh, unless he's bad, and then kill him. But when do we decide he's bad enough to be killed by his own soldiers? Do you know what I mean? So I'm finding myself like,
you're against monarchy, but you're defending the Targaryen right to rule?
No, I'm saying because I'm against monarchy, it doesn't work. Like, I am not
you could
really.
Say you're pro King Robert. You just don't think his kids should then, like, they should have to run for office.
Yeah, right. Like I'm pro King Robert over King Aerys, obviously, but I'm still like, this guy just like decided not only we should get rid of King Aerys, but also maybe I should be king. I'm like, says who? Like, who are you? Do you know what I'm saying? So I can see how and why Viserys and Dany are not in favor of Robert. Also because, like, apparently their mother was killed, their father was killed, and like their oldest sibling was killed. Like, it's all very bad for them, right?
So does this chapter make you more or less sympathetic to Robert, who we still haven't seen, but we have sort of a narrative bias towards after 2 Stark chapters?
Yeah, less sympathetic to Robert, but still like also not sympathetic to Viserys. Do you know what I mean?
Because it builds up, for me, it builds up Robert as sort of a fellow conqueror.
Yeah.
And I think there's an interesting narrative parallel between King Robert and Khal Drogo.
Okay.
Because neither one we see.
That's
They're both
true.
alluded to. They're both a presence, but they don't talk.
Yeah,
we don't meet them yet.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also both these brutes and conquerors.
That's true.
They are to be respected and feared.
That's
but
true.
we never get to know them on an intimate level. I think it's interesting when we still haven't met Robert to draw that sort of comparison, and kind of, if we're building this smoothie of King Robert, to throw in some Khal Drogo juice, I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and also I should say at this point, we don't know a ton about King Aerys. We know that Catelyn and the people in Westeros refer to him as Mad King Aerys, but like, what does that mean?
But we know Ned is noble, and we know that Viserys isn't.
Right.
So generally, we're more sympathetic with the North.
Oh, certainly, yeah. But I'm just saying, we actually don't know the full story of Aerys yet, so we don't actually know how bad he was. And so I think we can still be a little suspicious and skeptical of Robert while still being on Robert and the Starks' side.
But even after a chapter that engenders such sympathy with Daenerys, I don't have much sympathy for the Targaryen cause.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's and I think it works especially well because Dany does not care about the Targaryen cause. She doesn't care about being on the throne. I think if she ended up like being dragged to Westeros and like they got the throne back, she'd be like, okay, cool. But it doesn't matter to her that much. So it's great that we can be sympathetic to Dany, but also not be sympathetic to her cause yet, because she also isn't either. I also want to go back quickly to you connecting Dany with Jon, because I hadn't thought about that before. I think the thing about outsiders you said was really interesting, because like I think that ties well with what I was saying about how she wants to be like outside of prophecy and destiny and outside of this, like, you know, being this epic fantasy heroine who is destined to all these things. And of course she's an outsider in the world she's living in. But I also like you connecting her with Jon for the Targaryen stuff, like obviously spoiler.
Oh, sure.
Like,
yeah.
Spoiler, but like that's really interesting. So like right at the get-go, we are connecting Jon and Dany, even though they are not going to meet for years and years and years, and they're not going to have any sort of connection for a long time. So I think that's something I hadn't really thought about before, and like that's a connection I hadn't made, because like in my head, the Dany stuff is so separate for so long. Like it's this looming threat in the background to everything else going on in Westeros, but it feels so like literally far away and removed from everything happening in Westeros. But this connection, these more like symbolic, like literary connections are really interesting. So I want to track that as we go along.
We have one piece of leftovers of feedback from a listener.
Would you like me to read it?
Dear God, yes.
Okay, so this feedback is from Catherine, and Catherine seems to be responding to your Macbeth stuff, Cam, so this is great. She says, I think it's worth pointing out that at this point in the story, for all we know, Ned and Catelyn could turn out to be Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Sometimes it's hard to forget what you know when rereading a book. But if this was my first time going through Game of Thrones, then I wouldn't know for sure that the Starks aren't going to heel turn into villains, and the shadowy King Robert could absolutely be a Duncan-like figure. Just my 2 cents as a fellow longtime George fan. I can't wait for Tyrion to show up. Love the show. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, I love that. That's a really good point. Like, yeah,
it's hard to keep your head on a swivel,
right?
After 10 years,
and like, yeah, it's so confusing because like when you first read it, you of course at least 19-year-old me, of course, expected the Starks to be good and always be good. So I was never suspicious of them because I didn't know to be suspicious of everybody in this story just yet. But you're so right. If you're reading this from, I don't know, a more mature or cynical perspective, or you've read grim dark fantasy before, or you've read morally gray characters before, then yeah, you don't know that the Starks aren't actually going to turn out to be bad. So that's really interesting.
Especially because you know from Macbeth that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have that little discussion, that little scheming session when they do plan to kill Duncan. They like run off and hide and they're in this little secluded place. That could absolutely be the Godswood.
Yeah.
Like what we just saw.
Right. Also, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are the main characters of that play. And so even if we're like, well, but the Starks are our main characters, like, well, yeah, in that play, the main characters turn out to be very, very bad. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I could totally see that. That's a really great point, Catherine.
And now that we've met Dany, we have another perspective. So that's how this could play out, is that the Starks become the villains and Dany becomes the rebellion.
Right, especially if we're suspicious of Robert as the usurper. So, that's so true. Mm-hmm. That's really great. I love that. Love the way this weaves together.
Very cool.
Awesome. Well, remember, if y'all have feedback, we got this through an email. So thank you, Catherine. You can, if you have thoughts or feedback or ideas, you can share them to secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. You can also DM us on Instagram at secondbreakfastpod, or if you're on YouTube, you can comment down below. Also like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. That really helps. And also you can comment on Patreon if you're part of our Patreon. It's $2 a month. You get every episode that we release. It comes out as its own, post. And also you get a bonus episode every month, plus access to the whole back catalog of previous bonus episodes. We've been putting out bonus stuff for like almost 2 years now, 1.5 years. Mm-hmm. So check that out. It's in the description. We're just Second Breakfast Pod on Patreon. Also, I know we keep teasing it. I'm going to do it, Cam. I'm going to finish it today. If you're part of our Patreon, you can be part of our Christmas Tree of Whispers.
Oh, you are?
Which is a callback to our Diablo 4 coverage, the game. If you are here just for the books, Diablo 4 is a game we've been playing. It's really fun. We've been talking about it a lot. So listen to those episodes and enjoy being part of one of the heads on our Tree of Whispers for Christmas. So we'll be doing that pretty soon.
Next Tuesday is our final Tuesday of the year, which is going to be what, Maggie?
The Breckies. So every year we do a end of the year roundup where we talk about all of the stuff. Yeah, I think this is our 4th one. All the stuff that we have consumed over the past year, all the art we've looked at, movies, games, TV, books, shows,
best
music.
Works of art we've discovered this year, and our favorite works of art that have come out this year.
Yeah, so new this year or new to us this year.
It's a celebration.
Yeah, so we're working on finalizing those lists, and we're going to talk about them. So if you have any final make sure you watch this before the end of the year or read this or whatever kind of things, send those to us now, because this is coming out on Friday. Oh yeah, send us today. Do it today. Otherwise, just tune in and enjoy that. And I think that's all of the housekeeping stuff. We'll see you guys next week. Who are we reading from next week, Cam?
Ned.
That's right. We're reading from Ned next week, so we'll see y'all then. We're really excited for that. Ned's one of my favorite people to read from. And that's when I think we've been talking about how there's been a lot of setup in these chapters, and I think things are really going to start to happen with this Ned chapter. So I'm excited for the plot to really get going.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for putting up with my subpar voice.
You're doing great. Actually,
I'm very careful.
I'm very impressed the way you've gotten through this.
Thank you very much.
So
I'm ready
well
for
done.
it to be done.
I bet you are.
All right. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday.
Oh, and Merry Christmas.
Yeah,
and all that stuff. All right. See you Tuesday.